Hello and welcome. We are so excited today to have IBCLC Sarah Hartenberger with us, and I wanted to talk to her about night weaning. And this is a conversation that I'm really excited to have because from a sleep training and behavioral standpoint, I know the answer to how to get your baby night weaned, but it is a much more nuanced conversation, especially if you're a breastfeeding family, and there's just a lot that goes into it. And I have people asking me all the time these nuanced questions, and I wanted to be able to get some answers out there for my clients and for anyone who stumbles across this video. Hello, I'm Chelsea, and you are watching Tuned In Motherhood, and I'm so excited you're here. We talk about sleep, everything in the newborn and postpartum phases of your motherhood journey and beyond. And don't forget to subscribe and share this video if you found some value in it. All right, we are going to kick off this conversation with Sarah by thinking about some things that you might want to consider if you're thinking about night weaning or wondering how to get started or how long it's going to take. These are definitely some things that you're going to want to think about as you plan what your next move is.
All right, so my name is Sarah. I'm an IBCLC, also known as a lactation consultant and owner of Nurture Lactation here in Kansas City. So let's talk a little bit about night weaning. The first thing I want to talk about is how breastfeeding your baby at night is normal throughout the entire duration of however long you choose to breastfeed. So if night weaning is something that you feel somehow pressured to do, or it could be internal pressure, it could be pressure externally, but you really don't want to do it, then you don't have to do it, because at the end of the day, you have to do what works for you and your family. So something to think about there. When it comes to night weaning, what we know, like Chelsea said, that night weaning, it's really nuanced because there's a lot that goes into it, especially whenever it comes to age and milk supply and how well baby's growing. So to get started, in general, a good time to think about night weaning, and that can mean full night weaning, or it can mean cutting down your feeds, which actually is probably preferable. A good time to start doing that could be around 6 months. And the reason that we like this time is generally because by 6 months, you're usually in a pretty good groove with feeding. Baby is really out of that newborn stage. They're feeling like an actual little human that you get to interact with, and they've probably, hopefully, started solids, or they're close to it. And so we can kind of start thinking about that and understanding, okay, what is their little body going through in terms of adjusting to solid foods, adjusting to any growth spurts or changes in their brain and their body as they're growing, and how is that going to impact night weaning as we go forward?
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that is by 6 months too, you probably know your baby really well, and you can at least have a good sense for when they're really hungry and when they will need that night feed. And if you are working on sleep training, a big question I get is, well, how do I know if they're actually hungry or if they're just comfort nursing? And not that there's anything wrong with comfort nursing, but sometimes people want to pull back on that, and being able to know your baby really well by that 6 month mark, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, and so I have a lot of moms that come to me and say, like, hey, my baby's waking up 5 times a night, 4 times a night. And while I reassure them it can be normal, it's not always normal, but it can be normal. Some moms, we talk about, okay, let's get it down to 1 or 2 times a night. And many moms are okay with that. And they're like, okay, it's not full night weaning. So some things to take into consideration. First, how is your baby's weight gain doing? Have you struggled with breastfeeding throughout the course of this? Have you struggled with weight gain? Usually whenever there's a struggle with weight gain, there's something else going on behind the scenes. Maybe baby has a tongue tie. Maybe they have oral dysfunction. Maybe mom's milk supply is low and it hasn't quite been identified. And so looking into those things first and knowing that you have that settled in and working well is really, really important. And so weight gain, milk supply. The big thing with milk supply to consider is that whenever you cut down overnight feedings, your overall milk supply will drop. So I have moms sometimes ask me, okay, if I cut this night feeding, will my supply during the day drop? Typically the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Every once in a while I have a mom that by some magic, her milk supply doesn't drop overall. But think about it like 2 buckets. A lot of people think it's 2 buckets. You have a daytime bucket, you have a nighttime bucket. Honestly, it's actually the same bucket. And the reason for that is because your milk supply is regulated and driven by the frequency of stimulation, efficient stimulation by a baby or a pump that your breasts have in order to tell your body to make more milk. So if in a 24-hour period, say you're feeding baby or you're stimulating your breast 10 times and you cut it down to 8, that overall amount will go down.
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah.
The other big thing that we have to think about is the prolactin cycle. So prolactin is the hormone in your body that helps your body to make milk, and it cycles. And in the middle of the night, generally somewhere between, we'll say midnight and 6 a.m., that prolactin is at the highest. This is why moms will often tell me, oh, I pumped at 2 a.m. and I get my most amount at 2 a.m. and then that prolactin starts to slowly go down. And as the day goes by, then I'll see moms right around 4 or 5 o'clock p.m. They're like, oh, my baby's cluster feeding, or I'm not pumping as much, but then that prolactin again starts to go back up. And so that's normal. And so when it comes to night weaning, taking advantage of those hours where the prolactin is the highest can help your milk supply in a really big way.
Okay.
So
That's good to know.
when we take that out, it makes sense that it can hurt things a little bit. So let's talk a minute about growth spurts and sleep regressions. Growth spurts happen a lot during the baby's first year of life. Sometimes it's more obvious than other times. Typically, for example, that first 2-week growth spurt is really impactful to moms, and they really notice it because baby is cluster feeding a lot. The thing you have to remember too is that growth spurts are not just physical. They are also mental. So for example, maybe your baby is mastering a new skill. It could be in their brain, such as learning object permanence. Or it could be a milestone like learning to roll over.
Yeah, all those developmental.
And it can be so obvious because sometimes babies, they just want to practice that skill. And so they sleep terribly.
Yes.
And it's normal. And our job is to help them through. And, honestly, nursing can help them through that a lot. Because they're getting the comfort, they're getting the security, but then they're also helping to regulate their nervous system by sucking. That is normal for a baby. And so I think just being really aware and cognizant of what your baby might be going through rather than thinking it's not a you versus them thing. You're helping them through this rather than being like, oh, you're punishing me because you're not sleeping.
Right.
I think that can change your idea of
just that mindset shift.
Mindset,
yeah, you're working as a team to get through whatever the sleep regression is or growth spurt or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
And additionally, all these different disruptions in sleep can also affect when you might want to think about night weaning, and as you're planning to night wean or to cut back on those overnight feeds, things like travel, moving, a change in childcare, like if you have a change in your job and your work schedule changes, travel, daylight savings, pregnancy, if you're expecting a new baby, all of these different things can affect how your baby is reacting in their sleep schedule might change. And so that might also affect how, if you attempt to night wean or to cut back on those overnight feeds, how that might go. So as you're thinking about whether or not to night wean or how to cut back, definitely think forward in your life. Some of these changes, we cannot control or plan for, but think about what's coming up and kind of plan around those big life things that could affect how this goes for you.
I think it's also important to talk about, real briefly, the biological norms around breastfeeding. In our heads, and a lot of the messaging that's out, especially whenever babies have been in the NICU and moms have the NICU schedule, the messaging is often feed your baby every 2 to 3 hours.
Yes.
And so when we're set up for that, we don't allow ourselves to have the room for the small nursing sessions here and there, the cluster feeding here and there, when actually it's very, very normal for babies to nurse on cue. And that probably isn't every 2 or 3 hours.
Right.
So I always encourage parents to understand the rhythm that their baby has, but then also do something that we call parenting through breastfeeding. And so maybe your baby's sick, or there's sickness going through your house and your baby wants to be on the boob, and it can be hard, definitely, and it's okay to take a break, but understanding that these times are temporary and that as they work through whatever is going on in your life, you're using breastfeeding as a tool, or even, bottle feeding or holding your baby, or being, if you're not putting baby to breast, if you're pumping and bottle feeding, these are tools that you're using in your parenting toolbox to be able to get through that.
That really threw me for a loop when I first had my daughter 2.5 years ago, and I read all the books that said every 2 to 3 hours is when they should be feeding, and she wanted to feed more than that, and I was so conflicted, like, well, I want to keep her on this schedule or like rhythm or routine or whatever, but she clearly needs food, and it took me a long time to like work through that and trust myself to follow her lead a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's actually one of the hardest things when it comes to breastfeeding, especially whenever it comes to breastfeeding a baby that's a little bit older, that's starting to be on the move, and they're feeling attached to you, but they aren't in your arms all the time. And so it's a new change in dynamics.
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
tough to navigate, for sure. And then the other thing you want to think about as you're planning to night wean is factoring in the fact that your baby will need more calories and more feedings during the day to make up for those missed overnight feedings. So whatever rhythm, or if you have like a little loose schedule, that might shift. Well, it will shift. And you have to be ready for that as you prepare for this journey.
Yeah, so I will often see families when the baby sleeps longer stretches overnight, baby feeds more frequently. So maybe instead of every 3-ish hours, it's more like every 2. And again, if that works for you and you're okay with that, fantastic.
Yeah.
You just have to be aware.
Sure. The next thing we're going to talk about is how to know when it's the right time to start to night wean or cut back on those overnight feedings.
Yeah, so one thing we want to think about that we mentioned earlier, we got to make sure the baby is gaining well. If your baby's not gaining well, cutting out overnight feedings is probably not a good idea to do, especially because some babies that struggle to gain weight are fatiguing with their feedings during the day, and they literally don't have the availability or the strength to take in more milk during the day. So those night feedings are really, really important. So gaining well and then really good feedings during the day. We want them to be able to generally be able to settle pretty well on their own for naps, definitely. If you have a baby that is very reliant on nursing to sleep, again, this is not a bad thing. It's okay for a baby to nurse to sleep. And especially if you're okay with it, like it's your house, you do what you want. But having a baby that, is kind of showing that they're able to maybe nurse to sleep and then go down and stay asleep for a while, that's a pretty good sign.
Yeah.
Because if they're not staying asleep, that can be a sign that there's something kind of thrown off with their nervous system or with a sleep regression or a growth spurt.
All those developmental factors,
Yeah. And then you kind of want to think about not having any major changes coming up in your schedule for the next 2 weeks or so. And so don't do it right before a trip, because I guarantee you go on that trip and everything will be thrown off. Try not to do it before you are, changing up a schedule with daycare or parents start a new job, or, anything that you can think of that might be like, okay, we have this coming up. It could be, the holidays probably isn't a great time to do it. Not a great time. And then the other thing you want to think about is mom really has to be mentally okay with the fact that her milk supply probably will drop.
Yeah.
And maybe not only being prepared for that, but having a plan. So maybe if you're like, okay, I'm going to pay attention. If my milk supply drops, then I have this time in my day or this availability to be able to either nurse more or pump more to try to make up for that. I will even have some moms that are okay with their baby sleeping longer stretches of night, and they'll still get up and pump. And they're like, well, that's okay with me because I want to maintain my supply, but then I'm not, getting baby up and putting baby back down.
And then it can be too, like, more on their schedule, and it's not like, oh, the baby is up, I need to get, you need to wake up more. And so yeah, that makes sense. What about if a baby is kind of naturally night weaning, but they're not that either. They're not 6 months, or you just weren't ready for it. Do you recommend waking baby to feed, or like you said, pumping overnight? What do you advise your clients in that situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So some moms that I see at varying ages before 6 months will be like, oh, my baby sleeps 8 or 10 or 12 hours at night. And that's great for you for the sleep. Like, sleep is super important. That's amazing. Again, we know that the milk supply will drop overnight. And most of the time moms have to pump extra in order to get baby what they need. And so when they naturally night wean, sometimes it's okay. And sometimes when babies are not waking overnight to eat, it's because they're too fatigued, or they have too low of energy because they're not actually gaining weight well. They're not actually taking in enough milk during the day. And so it's kind of, we have to evaluate. That's why we go back to looking at, how is this baby gaining weight? How are they acting in between? If you have a baby who's nursing during the day, but they're acting real lethargic, and then they're sleeping long stretches overnight, but they're not gaining weight well, that is a huge red flag. That is very, very concerning. And I have encountered those babies before when, early on, maybe 6 or 8 weeks in, the parents are like, oh, they're sleeping 8 hours a night, but then come to find out that baby is not gaining weight well. And it's like, okay, this is a bad thing. Right.
So always coming back to the weight gain and just zooming out and thinking about that big picture, not just, oh, my baby slept 12 hours, which can feel really good, but we have to also think about the big picture.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned a red flag back there. Are there any more red flags that you might want to be on the lookout for when you're thinking about night weaning?
Yeah, so if your baby is feeding super frequently during the day, every 2 hours, every 1 hour, if you feel like they're on the boob all the time, or maybe they're getting on and they're taking a short feed. It's really short, and you're not seeing really big sucks and swallows, and then they come off and they fall asleep, and you're like, well, I guess they're done. That can be a sign that something is going on where they're not actually efficiently getting as much milk as they need. The other thing, like I mentioned, I'm a broken record on the weight gain issues. Weight gain just it can tell us a lot about what is going on. And not only weight gain, so we want a baby gaining weight. Some babies will maintain weight. That's also a red flag. Babies are supposed to continually gain weight, right? They're not, it's not just about, oh, they didn't lose weight. No, we need to keep them gaining weight, not just maintaining. And then colic-like symptoms. So colic is a term that gets thrown around, and it's a diagnosis, quote unquote, that is like, oh, well, your baby cries all the time, it's just colic. Colic is actually a symptom. Colic is when someone says, oh, my baby has colic, that usually means they spit up a lot, they cry a lot, they are not settled easily. But those are symptoms of something else going on. Sometimes that can mean a poor feeding, sometimes that can mean oral dysfunction or a tongue tie, sometimes because of things going on in the baby's life, maybe related to their birth, or something that happened after, or even something that may have happened in pregnancy. They come out and their nervous system is just kind of stuck in fight or flight, and they're not able to calm themselves down. And so when we talk about those colic-like symptoms, if your baby's having those, I would not recommend night weaning, because you need to figure out what else is going on.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so now we're going to talk about this step-by-step process about, if you've gone through all the things to consider, there are no red flags, you feel like you're ready, you feel like your baby's ready, how do you actually go about night weaning?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think the first thing you need to start with is kind of looking at, how many times is my baby feeding at night, waking at night to feed, and what am I comfortable with? What's my goal? And then you kind of work backwards into it. So some tips: have your partner help with night wakings. And so oftentimes your partner can help to soothe the baby back to sleep, and that can work. You can use a pacifier for soothing. We try not to use a pacifier as a crutch all the time. And we also need to understand that if a baby is truly hungry, whenever they take a pacifier and they suck, their body actually emits an enzyme that tells their body, their brain, and then their belly that they're not hungry anymore. And so often if a baby's actually hungry and they take that passy, they might settle and they might go back to sleep, but then likely they're going to be back up a short while later. Yeah. This might sound crazy, but talking to your baby ahead of time. I know
I'm a big believer in this.
Yeah, they can't talk back, but I guarantee you your baby is so smart and understands more than you realize. And so it's not like, hey, Junior, this is what we're going to do. This is the plan. But you can say, hey, when you wake up tonight, I will snuggle you. I will hold you. We're not going to have milk. It's all around the communication and setting boundaries.
Absolutely.
I know whenever I did this with my own children, that's exactly what I did. They were a little bit older, but it's exactly what I did.
Yeah, and I think it helps you as the parent too to feel confident going into executing this plan and to know that you're still providing your child with comfort and just being able to verbalize that, gives you confidence, and your baby definitely picks up on your energy and how you're feeling. And, we don't know how much they might understand beyond that, but just having that boundary in place for you and your baby, I think is really helpful and super important.
Yeah. And so if they're over 6 months of age, which ideally they are when we're night weaning, you can offer a sippy cup with a little bit of water at those night feedings. Or maybe, so for example, maybe your baby tends to wake at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 4 a.m. You could say to your baby, okay, if you wake up before midnight, we will have a sippy cup, we will snuggle, and then I'll put you back to bed. But then as you ease into it, at least in your head, you say, okay, if they wake up at that 1 o'clock and then at that 4 o'clock, I will nurse them.
Right.
Because maybe they actually are hungry at that point, and maybe they need time to adjust to nursing more during the day and taking more calories in during the day and not have that Band-Aid ripped off completely.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing to think about is sometimes you can do a little bit more nursing right before bed. And so maybe this looks like allowing them to cluster feed a little bit. Maybe this looks like a dream feed, which is one of my favorite things. A dream feed is where maybe you nurse baby to sleep, you put baby down for bedtime, and then say you go to bed an hour, maybe 2 later, before the baby's already woken up for the first time, and you actually just go in, pick baby up, feed baby, and then put them right back down. And many times this can work beautifully and the baby will just go right back to sleep. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it doesn't work for everyone, but kind of like tanking baby up a little bit more to help them not have to get up as quickly.
Yeah, and it depends on the baby how if it works well or if you need to come up with a different approach here. But yeah, I like dream feeding, and I started a dream feed pretty late with my baby for this exact reason. I didn't think she was ready to fully night wean. I wasn't ready to night wean. I wanted to keep my supply up, and it worked really well for us. And kind of got us over that hump where we weren't ready, but I wanted more sleep, and then we were ready, and it worked great.
Yeah. Some families will do a bottle, so maybe mom pumps and partner gives a bottle. The only caveat to that is you just have to be careful that you don't overfeed baby.
Sure.
Because if you overfeed baby, they could then spit up, they could get an upset stomach, and that just kind of ruins all your plans anyway. So, giving them a little bit of extra milk without overfeeding could be helpful.
So this has all been super helpful. Thank you for kind of talking us through all these different things to think about and how to go about this process in a way that makes sense from a lactation standpoint and perspective. Is there anything else you want to share or final advice you want to give?
Yeah, so I think something that you really got to remember is set expectations for yourself and then have grace with the process, because you might be feeling really good because it's going really well for a couple days, and then you take a step or two backwards and you're like, well, it was going great. What happened? Right. And so I think just like setting those expectations for you, but also having patience for the process and giving yourself grace. And maybe you think you want to night wean, and then you get into it and you're like, okay, actually I don't really like this. That's okay. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. And then also just remembering that if your supply drops, you definitely, in order to keep it up, if that's something that you want to do, pumping potentially in the middle of the night, maybe first thing in the morning after the feeding, depending on what your supply is like. I'll also say that if you are trying this and you're struggling, or you just want kind of a written plan or, you know, support, you can definitely reach out to an IBCLC. That is definitely something that we are well equipped to do and help you through and give you that support and advice.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. And we'll have to have you on again sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome.